For once, the word crisis is not really overstated. This really is something. If only looking at my area of the world, the Middle East, this is probably the most extraordinary series of events in the modern Middle East. You certainly have to go back at least to 1967 and the Six-Day War to find anything comparable. Some of you may or may not know that, although you're aware of the fact that it took place and that this war took place, what you probably don't know is that that was where most of these dictators that are now being thrown out, that's where they came from. It was the breakdown of the system after the humiliation of the Arabs by the Israelis in 1967 that eliminated a lot of the old guard and brought in a new bunch who then turned out to be just as bad and permanent. If you want to look back even further than that, you could go back to the end of World War I when the Europeans carved up the Middle East into spheres of influence. And in some respects, there are some similarities about that today in the sense that you really have a sort of global earthquake going on, not just in Japan, but a political earthquake that's going on in the Middle East. And it's probably worth remembering that none of those events, whether you're looking at 1916 and the Sykes-Picot Treaty or the 1967 war, neither of those actually worked out very well. And I think we have to be prepared for the fact that this series of events is perhaps not going to work out that well either. Why did this Arab Spring happen? What was the reason for it, and why now? You're all interested in predictions and risk management, and so I'm happy to tell you that I wrote an article called The Coming Crisis of the Persian Gulf, which gave all the reasons why the monarchies of the Gulf were living on borrowed time. I wrote that in 1997, and I'm not particularly proud of the fact that it took this long to actually for something to happen, and then it didn't happen the way I expected at all. We've all known for years that there was a serious set of problems in the Middle East, and the rulers were, that it was ripe for change. Many of these countries had the same rulers, the same dictators, certainly the same ruling family, whether it was a republic or a monarchy, for 30 or more years. There was rampant corruption, no room for public expression, blatantly rigged elections, crude tyrannies that relied primarily on repression and torture to sustain themselves, and thoroughly incompetent management of economies, stagnation, unemployment, inflation, brain drain, and lack of economic opportunity. The emperor in all of these cases really had no clothes, and everybody knew it. It was not a secret, there was nothing peculiar about it, but the rulers were really good at one thing, and that was repression and control. And it was difficult to figure out how this was going to end. There had been demonstrations on and off for years and years and years, decades, but they never really blossomed. Nothing quite came of it. So I think a lot of people weren't really prepared when the moment finally came. What was really missing was some kind of a trigger. Curiously enough, it turned out to be a young man who set himself on fire in an obscure little town in Libya, who set this whole thing off. Obviously, things like that have happened in the past, and they didn't set things off, but it was as if everything was sitting there waiting for a spark, and that spark happened to be that young man. The other factor, of course, as we're all aware, was social networking and communications, that word could spread in a way that it had not been able to do so before. Actually, communications is, we talk about it as being something totally new. In reality, the Iranian Revolution, which I watched happen, they used cassette tapes. and the Ayatollah in Paris would make a speech or give a talk. They would send it by telephone line to Iran, record it on tape, mass produce thousands of copies, and then take them out into the bazaar and hand them out to people. That's pretty crude by our current standards of how you communicate, but the reality is it worked, and it overthrew the Shah. The Soviets in the Russian Revolution and afterwards in trying to overthrow Stalin, it was they used samizdat. They mimeographed papers and turned them out by hand and then circulated them secretly to different people to pass information and analysis. So there are old tricks that have worked. This simply, I would say, it speeded things up. The other thing was that there was a lot of complacency. These guys, the rulers, had all been there for so long that they really had forgotten that, I mean, the old tricks worked. Somebody would show up and start demonstrating. The police would come out and round them up, beat them, toss them in jail. If that didn't work, they would let loose a goon squad that would come out, people in civilian clothes who were really working for the government, and they would beat people up and scare them to death, and people would go home and they would give up. They expected those tricks, and they tried those tricks. All of those were tried in these current revolutions, these current revolts, and for once they didn't work, and they didn't know what to do. Frankly, all of these rulers simply, well, particularly in the case of Tunisia, he just lost his nerve. He couldn't face the fact that this was a different situation than he had faced before, and he turned and ran. And Mubarak, it took a little bit longer, but the reality was he had no answer. Once people showed that they were not going to be intimidated, and this was the key thing, is that they somehow had lost their fear, and they all talk about this. And the fact that they had lost their fear meant that the old fear techniques just didn't work anymore, and they found themselves out of a job. After Tunisia and Egypt, however, the remaining rulers took a lesson from that, and we're seeing a different approach now. We're using the full coercive power of a government, military force, shooting their own people. So we now have a full-fledged civil war in Libya, and the Gulf Cooperation Council has officially turned itself into a kind of monarchical protection society that basically we will not let any of our people be thrown out of a job. And that has to work itself out. So I think there's we have to stop and at least think about the fact that this Arab Spring may turn into an Arab winter before it's done. And we don't know whether and how that will happen. The other thing that worries me particularly about the way things are proceeding is the role of sectarianism in this. The Arabs, for years, have been absolutely petrified about Iran. They really have been terrified that, sort of the Iranians were coming. There was an Iranian under every bed. And in particular, and this is particularly true in Saudi Arabia, there was the feeling that since Iran is a Shia country, that anywhere you find a Shia, you just scratch that Shia a little bit, and there's an Iranian lurking just below the skin. It's a very nifty single explanation for all of the problems that were going wrong in the Arab world, for everything that happened that they didn't like. You had a boogeyman. You had somebody that you could blame. And to someone like me, who was around during the days of the Cold War, a lot of this looks quite familiar, that having a single enemy that you can identify and use that as sort of your organizing principle for your entire foreign policy is a very useful thing. And so I know that certainly the Saudis certainly feel that way, and they are acting on the basis of that. And I think there's a real chance that other Arabs certainly, but also the United States may possibly end up pursuing exactly the same thing. One of the things that worried the Saudis the most, and I've heard this directly from their foreign minister, was that the rise of what he would call Iranian influence in the Gulf. And unlike many of us Americans, he had an explanation for that. He noted that in 2001, we went into Afghanistan and scattered the Taliban, which was Iran's worst enemy to the east. And then before we were done with that, we turned around and went into Iraq and got rid of Saddam Hussein, who was Iran's worst enemy to the west. And then we installed a Shia government in Baghdad for the first time in many centuries to have a Shia government. And from the point of view of the Saudis, that was actually creating, basically what we did was just hand the Gulf and influence to Iran on a silver platter. I was in a meeting not too long ago with a very senior U.S. government official who had been involved in the policymaking during that period of time. And he was going on at great lengths about all the horrible things that Iran was doing and the way it was having a bad effect on everybody's politics in the region. And I said, I understand that, and I share your view, but didn't we have something to do with that, with our own actions in Afghanistan and Iraq and the like? And he stopped for a second and he said, well, we didn't mean to. And I think we didn't mean to. That was not our objective. The reality is that's where it came out. And if you are an Arab and you are seeing the Persian enemy that you don't like, and there's a good deal of racism going on both sides, actually. The Persians dislike the Arabs and the Arabs dislike the Persians. But if you see this Persian behemoth sort of rising up, and the United States actually assisting them very actively in their the power buildup that was going on, you ask yourself, what side of the Americans really on? If you talk to a lot of Arabs, you will find that, unlike us, they have not forgotten the fact that we had a very close relationship with the Shah and a tight relationship with Iran that went beyond just ordinary geopolitics. And then, again, they remember that in the mid-'80s, in the middle of the Iran-Iraq War, the United States began secretly selling arms to Iran behind everybody's back, while openly claiming that they weren't going to do anything of the sort. In both cases, the Arabs felt that they were betrayed and left out. And now when the Americans come back and tear up the natural enemies of Iran on either side and leave Iran emerging as the major power in the Gulf, the Arabs have a hard time believing that that was inadvertent, that this is something that we just did in a moment, a fit of absent-mindedness, even if that's what we did. So I think we have a little bit of a repair job to do when we are talking to the Arabs about this particular part of our history.